All right, I think we're good. I can advance the slides.
Perfect. Yeah, no, it's working way better than it was for me. So
Okay, I'll be the technical guru today, so please be patient with me because usually Dylan's the technical guy. So, Dylan, you want us to get started? Do you want me to start off and then I'll turn it over to you?
yeah, that works.
All
So
right. Um, Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Our first webinar of the season. We like to kick off with this one. Education is special. It really sets a nice guideline for families, talking again about special education law and regulations, diving into the IEP process. And then also providing some tips for families. So welcome. I am Allison Weist. I am a parent trainer with Maine Parent Federation. I've been with the agency in this role for a couple of years, and prior to that, I was a family support navigator. I also have a 11, almost 12-year-old boy with an autism diagnosis. Like everybody else that works for Maine Parent Federation, I have that personal lived experience. So that's a little bit about me. I'll turn it over to Dylan, my colleague, and let him introduce himself.
So thank you, Allison, and thank you everyone for taking time out of your day today to be with us. So I'm Dylan Campbell, and I'm a youth coordinator, and I'm the other parent trainer here with MPF. I've been with the agency since around 2017, initially starting off in that youth coordinator role, but really the last few years, Allison and I have been working closely together to create all of the trainings that we have listed out for you today, as well as some materials. So I'm actually posting a link in the chat box right now. And at this link, you can find a previously recorded version of our webinar, as well as you can download our slides today. And we have a parent-friendly booklet that we've created. So it's most of the content that you'll see today, but written in a format for families. So I can paste the link. Um,
All
so
right.
having so many issues that I can't even paste my link. I'll put that in the box for you folks. And you can, if you want, feel free to download it and you can follow along with us today.
And again, if for some reason, if the links don't work or the chat box or whatever, I'll make sure that I have everybody's email who is here today. And I can also make sure that everybody gets the information following this training. We are recording today as well, so this will be up on our website.
And just as a disclaimer, we are not legal advocates and we do not provide any legal advice. So all of the information that you're hearing today from us is really just general guidance for you and your family. And I did have luck posting a link, so there you are. Feel free to access that. But really how we're going to break up today's training is we're going to dive into the introduction to special education regulations. So we're not expecting you to leave today being experts on special education, but we're hoping that you feel a little bit more familiar with the process and some of the terms that we will be using. Later on in the presentation, we'll dive into the details of the IEP and then the differences between that and a 504 plan. And then towards the end, we'll talk about procedural safeguards and due process. So how do you address your needs when your needs are not being met? And we have some additional resources for you as well. But really kind of, breaking into things, taking a look at from the bird's eye view, all public education is provided by the federal and state departments of education. So here at the federal level, that's the United States Department of Education. And here in Maine, that's Maine's Department of Education. So we can go to the next slide, Allison. And the reason why we bring this up is it's important to understand who is overseeing special education at which level. So again, at that federal level, we're thinking the whole of the United States. Special education is mandated by a law that we call IDEA, and this is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This program oversees all things special education, and it provides for the creation of the Office of Special Education Programs. So at the federal level, we have the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. At the state level, you may have heard these terms before, but we regulate special education through Maine's Unified Special Education Regulations. This is also called Chapter 101 or MUSER. And this is how we address special education here in Maine. And we can go to the next slide, Allison. Oh, actually, we can go back to the other slide. I think there's something important here to note. So one thing to note here about Maine's special education law, MUSER, is that all must meet or exceed the protections provided by IDEA. So there's never a time in MUSER where you will have less protections than you do from the federal law. So it must meet or exceed those federal standards. Sorry about that, Allison.
Oh, you're fine.
And one of the first important term that I want you to become familiar with today is highlighted here in blue. So really the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, that federal law, is there to provide that federal financial assistance to state and local agencies to ensure a free and appropriate public education. And we'll dive into what a free and appropriate public education means. But really that's the goal, is that we're trying to increase the access of education for our students, and this law provides the federal funding to do so. So without getting too much into that federal law, I just want to let you know about some of the big components of each part of the law. So really there are 4 parts of IDEA, and this first part is really what creates the rest of the act. So it lays out the foundation. It defines the terms that are used, and it also provides for the creation of that federal United States Department of Education Office of Special Education Programs. Then that office then oversees and administers all things IDEA. Part B and Part B 619, this is where we start laying out the educational guidelines for school children, specifically ages 3 to 22. But then Part B 619 is specifically for individuals ages 3 to 5. And what this part does is it declares that states are required to educate students with disabilities, and then it provides the financial support for them to be able to do so. So it requires schools to identify and educate students. Part C is when we start thinking of, the early kiddos. So, birth through 2 years old. These are individuals that are not in the school system, but at this age, we're identifying if they might need services in the future. So through early intervention, EI is how we do that, and Part C provides those guidelines on how we provide services for children birth through 2. It identifies who is responsible for child find, and we'll get into this as well later on, but child find is how schools identify and connect with students that may need services in the future. But it also indicates the eligible services that families are able to access through IDEA at this age range, and then who is responsible for providing those services. So Part C is specifically birth through 2 years old. And then Part D, this is a slightly different focus, but Part D really describes the national activities that help improve the education. So what that means is, for an example, we receive some of our funding through Part 4 of IDEA. And this allows us to create these trainings, to connect with families, and to educate on the process of special education and then transitional services. So Part D lays out those funding and the support programs that allow similar programs to this. I have to get up to speed with my notes since I'm not sharing.
No, that's okay, Dylan.
And so diving in, moving away from the federal level into the state level, we have MUSER. So Maine's Unified Special Education Regulations. This is our special education law. You can go to the next slide as well. So as I was mentioning briefly before, currently MUSER must meet or exceed the federal law of IDEA. And if you've ever seen a copy of what MUSER looks like, it's a rather thick document, but you'll notice that there's italicized language and non-italicized language. That language within italics is the state language. That's where Maine exceeds the services and supports. So that means that non-italicized language within MUSER That is verbatim from that federal law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And the italics language is where Maine must meet or exceed. Is there anything you want to add to that piece, Allison?
I will just mention briefly, and we're not going to go too deep into it, but I know that the state is looking at our Muser Chapter 101, and there's going to be um, some changes made. There will be opportunities for families to, to listen to what's happening and comment on that. But these regulations are being looked at and changes being made. So that will be coming. And again, Maine Parent Federation, we're always staying on top of what's happening with legislature and changes that are being made. So we will provide families with that information as we get it.
Thank you for sharing that piece. Um,
Is this you or is this me now?
I believe this one is still me. And this brings us to the second term that I want us to kind of focus on today. So that first term was FAPE, a free and appropriate public education. And then the second term is specially designed instruction. And the reason why I think this is so important to focus on is it's personal. For me, this is how I started understanding really what special education was and how it differed from, say, accommodations. But special education is specially designed instruction provided at no cost to the parents to meet the unique needs of a child with a disability. So specially designed instruction, it's altering the curriculum to meet the needs of our individuals. And that's an important piece when identifying what special education is and where it's needed. And we can go to the next slide as well, Allison.
Thanks, Dylan. I think this is me at this point. We can shift gears and give you a break. So as Dylan was mentioning, SDI, or specially designed instruction, really is the key component to what special education is. So, and again, as Dylan had mentioned, free and appropriate public education that would include that specially designed instruction that Dylan was mentioning. It includes that in the classrooms as well as outside of the classroom. So when we're thinking about art and PE or gym, some of the music, those other components of a student's day also would again, specially designed instruction, altering the curriculum would be part of that as well. When determining appropriate by an IEP team, access to that specially designed instruction can also be received at home or in other places like hospitals. So again, you may be familiar with this during the COVID pandemic, where students who, again, received special education, their specially designed instruction was part of their school day at home as well. And then services and accommodations. So this is sort of your other accommodations and services that happen outside of the specially designed instruction, meaning speech therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, BCBAs, and we'll dive deeper into that. But these are all part of the free and appropriate public education and the special education that a student will receive. And again, I kind of touched on this, but here are examples of services that a student would receive: speech, occupational, physical consultation from specialists, and that's where I mentioned the BCBAs, any counseling services that a student might receive, and then extended school year services, ESY. Again, that is a service that a student might qualify for if it's necessary for them to maintain the education that they've learned throughout the school year. Examples of accommodations could include extra time for schoolwork, included standardized testing, motor breaks throughout the day. Maybe they have, preferred seating or flexible seating. Maybe they're at the front of the classroom. Being able to take tests verbally rather than written, if writing is a challenge. And then paraprofessional support. So again, that one-to-one support that a student might need throughout their day is included in their special education program. Also, it could include other things like positive behavior interventions and supports, behavior plans. If a functional behavior assessment is done and a behavior plan is needed, that would be included. Social and emotional skills. So again, being part of social or emotional groups and learning opportunities. And then as the student gets older, independent living skills, transition plans from high school into adulthood, as well as vocational rehabilitation services. So again, all part of special education under the law.
And so now we've arrived at what I always jokingly call the core of our presentation. But this is at the IEP, the Individualized Education Program. And most of you are probably familiar with an IEP and what it looks like, but really kind of talking about this a little bit more. The IEP is a document which ensures all children with disabilities have access to that free and appropriate public education. So really the core goals of the IEP is to really indicate what education services and accommodations should be provided based on the student's needs. Eligibility is determined by MUSER, Maine Unified Special Education Regulations, and this plan is developed by the IEP team. And really the goal here is that we're trying to place students in their the most successful environment, their least restrictive environment. And that's an important topic to focus on as well, because the least restrictive environment is not just about location. It's about all of the factors in the student's day that lead to them being successful. It's about who's providing the training. It's about where it's being provided. It's about how it's being given to them. And when we're thinking about our least restrictive environment, we should always try to think of the mainstream classroom first as a priority. If we can't provide services with accommodations and services within the mainstream classroom, and then in those cases, the least restrictive environment may be outside of the mainstream classroom. But we're always really trying to think of what will provide our student the most success and how can we implement that for them. And the IEP is really that document to do that. So kind of diving into what I had briefly mentioned at the beginning, child find. So this is the process by which many students are identified, but the school district is mandated to engage in this process to identify which students need access to special education services. This generally begins at a young age, and students are required that districts find and identify those students, but referrals can be made at any time and by many individuals, whether that's you as a parent, a professional you're working with, or even a school staff member. It's how we identify students which may need access to services. One thing that's important to note here, and I won't get too much into the details as well, is if you choose to homeschool or attend a private school, I always say this kind of confusing, but if you choose to attend a private school or homeschool, you are not protected under IDEA in the same way. However, this is a different topic when we start talking about special purpose private schools, so that does not apply to them in this case. But child find is generally the process in which students identify which students are needed. And so kind of diving in to those early ages again, birth to 2 years old. At this age, it can be kind of difficult to, diagnose an individual. So we kind of use this blanket term for developmental delay. So we'll take a look at all the different areas of where a child may be developing, cognitive development, physical, communication, social and emotional and adaptive development, and see where they are amongst their peers. Since they're not in school at this time, we are not going to be creating an IEP, an individualized education program, but instead, a term to be familiar with is an IFSP, an individualized family service plan. So for kiddos birth to 2 years old, we're going to start looking at that developmental delay and see where they are amongst their peers.
And again, I'll just mention too, at this age, in the state of Maine, Child Development Services is the agency that is delivering these services and evaluating students, and writing the IFSP. So again, at this age, families are communicating and working with Child Development Services.
Thank you for that.
Yes.
And then as our kiddo ages, specifically 3 to 5, we're still gonna be able to use developmental delay to qualify. And we're still going to take a look at the different developmental areas. But at this point, the kiddo may be entering school, and we're really going to start focusing on how do we create the IEP. So how do we transfer the individualized family service plan into an individualized education plan that can be used at the school? And again, we're always focusing on that least restrictive environment for our students. Where are they most successful? How are they most successful? And how can we meet them where they're at? And if you did download the booklet in the link that I had sent over, on page 13 we have a list of all the identified disabilities. So 5 years old is the last year that we can use developmental delay as a qualifying criteria for special education. Instead, we're going to start looking at one of those 13 identified disabilities. And really, those 13 identified disabilities, they're broad topics that many disabilities fall under. So I'm going to take a look at how that meets and fits with our student. And then we also must think about how does that diagnosis negatively impact their ability to access education in the general curriculum. So it's a little bit more than just having a diagnosis. We need to talk about and think about how is that negatively impacting their access in the general curriculum.
I'll just share too, just because I have the booklet in front of me, and I know sometimes people are wondering what the qualifying diagnoses are. I will just read them off, but they are in the booklet. Autism, deafblindness, deafness, emotional disturbance, hearing impairment, intellectual disability, multiple disabilities, orthopedic impairment, other health impairment, specific learning disability, speech or language impairment, traumatic brain injury, and visual impairment. So those are the 13 qualifying diagnoses. And again, as Dylan had mentioned, it must negatively impact the student's ability to access the general curriculum in order for them to qualify for special education.
And I am actually copying and pasting those in the box for you folks as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Dylan. So I'm going to let Dylan off the hook and I'll chat for a little bit here. So we talked a little bit about the laws. We've talked about the IEP, the Individualized Education Program. Now we're going to talk a little bit about those meetings. So the initial IEP meeting, we talked about child find too, and I'll just clarify that a little bit. So again, child find being how students are now I'm losing my words too, found, how they're identified. Thank you. How they're identified. And again, that can be the school that's identifying a student through observations or, maybe a teacher refers a student, parents can refer students. And again, a student has been identified as possibly needing services. So now we need to start the process. That initial IEP meeting needs to be held, it says, within a reasonable time period after a referral is made. It's usually pretty quickly. In my experience, and I think in most cases, it's within like 15 days, within a 2-week window. And in that meeting, the strengths of the students and the concerns of the students are discussed, and then a determination of what evaluations need to be completed. So again, we're going to be talking about, what is challenging for the student, and then how can we assess them and evaluate them to determine whether they're eligible for special education services. We're going to review the student's current present level of performance. The acronym is PLOP. And that we're going to be looking at academics, social and emotional learning as well. So again, really looking at where the student is now, what assessments do we need to determine if the student is eligible? And that's done in that initial IEP meeting after the referral is made. So the purpose of the IEP meeting is to determine goals and accommodations. So the goals are really like, what needs to happen? What does a student need for services? And the accommodations are really how are we going to to deliver, and how is the student going to receive their education and be successful. So when we're thinking about goals, we're thinking about academics, reading, writing, and math. We're thinking about social and emotional learning. And I know sometimes that's not always included, but again, for a student who has challenges in that area, it really should be included. And then functional and developmental goals, certainly, behavioral if needed, and then therapeutic. Again, thinking about occupational therapy, physical and speech therapy as well. And then when we're thinking about accommodations a student might need, we kind of touched on this earlier as well, but maybe a student, needs some assistance with, sensory. Maybe there's some sensory items that they tend to avoid or they seek out, things like that. My son tends to have trouble with really loud noises, and we have that at the bottom. Noise canceling headphones for fire drills. So things like that. Preferred seating again, breaks if needed, any type of assistive technology to be successful, and additional time. And again, advanced warning of emergency drills and noise canceling headphones if needed. And again, a student can have, or a couple of students can have the same diagnosis. Two students could have an autism diagnosis, but their IEP program is going to look, or can look completely different depending on what the needs are. So when is an IEP meeting held? So in general, the team must meet at least annually. That's a minimum to revise and update the student's IEP. Parents, and we have it at the bottom, did you know you can request a meeting at any point? And I am one of those parents. Annually doesn't always feel like enough, depending on what's going on. So again, having that communication with the school and feeling comfortable. Sometimes it doesn't mean that the entire team needs to get together. Maybe there's some challenges happening, in occupational therapy maybe, and maybe it's a matter of the special ed teacher and the occupational therapist and the parent coming together. But again, you can request a meeting at any time. In the IEP meetings, reviewing the evaluations. Again, that happens in the beginning, can happen if there's other evaluations that are determined necessary. Looking at that present level of performance, measuring progress towards goals and adapting them accordingly. It's another time when we would want to meet if a student is not meeting their goals. We need to take a look at why that's not happening. Maybe the goals are need to be broken down into smaller steps. So taking a look at that, allowing parents as well as teachers the opportunity to provide updates on a student. We want to know how our student's doing, or if there's something new going on in our child's life, being able to have that opportunity to communicate with the school about that. And then consider changes to services accommodations. Again, things are always changing. So it's important to at least meet annually, if not more often than that. So when we're thinking about evaluations, again, sort of going back to, okay, we have a student that we're trying to determine whether they're eligible or not. We need some evaluations done. Then the IEP team, determines that it's necessary, and the school then has 45 days to conduct the evaluation and then hold a meeting to discuss the results. And the emphasis here being on 45 school days, so that doesn't include weekends or breaks or holidays or anything like that. And then CDS, or Child Development Services, for the younger kiddos, if they're performing evaluations, they have 60 calendar days. So again, it's not as straightforward. Both agencies do it a little bit different. So it's important to keep that in mind. And also important to keep in mind as parents that you should be receiving evaluations at least 3 days prior to a meeting. And I have run into this personally where, evaluations are being done and it's crunch time. And so I have gotten an evaluation the night before a meeting. And as a parent, you can say that you haven't had enough time to review an evaluation and you need more time to review it and get your thoughts together and questions. And so you can reschedule a meeting if you haven't had time to review evaluations. So it really is important, I think, for families to receive those evaluations so you have ample time to take a look and again, get your thoughts organized and your questions ready for the meeting. So in addition to the annual meetings or other meetings, there is also a triennial IEP meeting. And this is done every third year for students who receive special education. And this is the time when a student is assessed again to see if they are still eligible for special education. So again, it's a lot of assessments that are happening. You know, a child is being retested. We're looking at again, how they're doing, their present level, what their challenges are. So this can sometimes be a difficult meeting sometimes for families, again, because we're really focusing on what are the challenges, what do we need for assessments, what's going on to determine if they are still eligible for services. So planning for an IEP meeting, the school will send out an advance written notice 7 days prior to the meeting. And that advance notice lists who's going to be present at the meeting, and then it states the reason for the meeting. Parents are, you know, you can bring somebody from the outside if your child is working with an outside speech therapist or maybe sees a counselor outside of the school. You as a parent can invite them to the meeting. We always recommend that you let the school know that you're bringing somebody, excuse me, to a meeting. You don't want anybody to feel blindsided if they didn't know that somebody was coming to a meeting and has information to share. And then also it's important if for some reason you're planning to bring legal representation to a meeting, or you're planning to record a meeting, you must let the school know. And then in turn, they also have the right to bring legal representation if they need to, or feel they need to. So again, we just say in general, it's always the best practice if you're planning on bringing somebody else to a meeting to let the school know in advance. Familiarizing yourself with the IEP team and each of their roles is important, especially in the beginning. It can be really overwhelming for families because there's a lot of people sitting around the table, and getting to know who they are is really important. There will be an administrator. That is the person who works for the school district that authorizes the funding. That might be a special education administrator. It could even be a principal. So that's the person that's authorizing that federal funding. A special education teacher, which is often also the case manager for the student, and then a mainstream teacher, as well as therapists, counselors in the school. So again, it can be a very big meeting and it can be overwhelming, but it's really important to know who they are. And also to remember that as a parent, you are a key member of the team, and you shouldn't feel that you don't have a right to speak up, or you shouldn't feel uncomfortable sharing information because you are a key member. What you have to say is valuable. You know your child best, and you really have key insight into shaping your child's education plan as well. So always feeling like you are an equal member in that team as well. I think sometimes too, I know for myself, I feel like IEP meetings somehow get short, the time duration gets shorter and shorter. So it can be a really hectic meeting, a busy meeting. There's a lot to discuss. So it's always important, I think, to number one, have things written down, and sometimes prioritizing your concerns, your top 3 concerns. If for some reason you can't get to some of the other ones, you can always ask for another meeting and follow up at a later date. Sometimes too, it's great if you already have some ideas or solutions. If there's a concern you have, if you already have some ideas about how to solve that, or something that's working at home or whatever, bringing that to the school as a possible strategy or solution to a problem is helpful. And then also bringing data. Data is really important to assist and any requests that you're making. So again, if you have information from an outside doctor or therapist or counselor, whether it's progress reports or evaluations, any data that you can bring to the table to the IEP team to really, reinforce any requests or concerns you have is also important and encouraged. Tips, again, coming prepared with written questions. I know for me, sometimes you get in there and you get talking and you might forget what you wanted to talk about. I'm notorious for that. So having it written down. And then also picking some available dates to reconvene. If you feel like you have a lot to talk about and you're probably not going to be able to cover it in the time frame that you have, jot down some dates that you're available to meet again. And then in that meeting, at the end of that meeting, if you haven't had a chance to finish, then you can say, oh, I have these dates available. Would you be available so we can meet again to finish talking about what we need to talk about? And then after the IEP meeting, the school sends a prior written notice. So we have the advance written notice prior to the meeting, and then we have the prior written notice. So a prior written notice, again, within a reasonable time period. But this is what lists what the school plans to do or refuses to do related to the identification, evaluation, or educational placement of your child. So it's the prior notice before whatever their plan is. And it's important to look at this document equally as important as looking at the IEP because again, it's it's telling you what they're planning to do. So if something is missed on there, you talked about something in a meeting and it's not on the prior written notice, you need to contact the school and find out why. And some examples, again, would be, you'd receive one before an initial evaluation, before any changes happen in placement or services. And then also if a school is refusing to do an evaluation that a parent might be asking for. So again, just an important document to take a look at and keep. After the IEP meeting, a parent should receive an updated copy of an IEP within 21 school days. Again, noticing that it's school days here. I do feel like, hold on, I'll finish saying this after, but the IEP changes are implemented within 30 calendar days. So again, we're talking school days, calendar days, just to make it a little confusing. I know in my experience, typically the changes that we make to the IEP are implemented before I even receive a copy of the IEP. So sometimes that can happen as well. So just to know the time frames for that. I guess that's it. Now I'm going to turn it over to Dylan to talk about 504 plans.
So shifting gears a little bit for that, and I wanna invite everyone to if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat box so far. If you have anything that you privately want us answered, Allison and I can stick around and do that after our recording today. So please do so if that's something you're interested in. But shifting gears, we're going to start talking about 504 plans. And generally, 504 plans are intended to help a student, access their curriculum by building in supports and accommodations. So generally, a lot of the kiddos that we'll see that have 504 plans, they may need support, but not to the level of an IEP. So if you remember at the very beginning when I mentioned specially designed instruction, we do not have that in 504 plans. So 504 plans are not a part of special education services. They do not provide those services, but they do provide accommodations. And if you did happen to download the booklet here, we have a great graphic on the next slide here. And this, I think, is a great way to visualize what are the differences here and why do we talk about them in a different way. So when we're thinking about an IEP, this is special education, we're thinking about IDEA, that federal law. Whereas a 504 plan, that falls under a completely different law. So a 504 plan is a part of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And in turn, this is a civil rights law, so it's not an educational law like IEP is. So that also means that there are different departments that oversee each of these plans. So an IEP is at that federal level, the Office of Special Education Programs. And then a 504, they're really mandated by the Office of Civil Rights. And the eligibility requirements and what they provide is different as well. So the eligibility requirements for 504 is that a student has a disability that significantly impacts one or more major life activities. Whereas for an IEP, the diagnosis criteria is a little bit more refined. It's one of those 13 qualifying disabilities, or if under the age of 5, a developmental delay. And what is provided is different for these individuals. So, like we keep mentioning, in IEP, we're accessing special education services, related activities, as well as accommodations. Whereas with a 504, we're getting the accommodations and modifications, but we're not getting the specially designed instruction. So it's implementing the environmental factors that help us access that general curriculum. It's not changing what the curriculum is offering. And I think
Sorry, Dil.
This just really clarifies in a lot of the same words we had just mentioned, but it allows for an individual to receive a free and appropriate public education by changing the environment to remove the barriers to access that education. So how do we provide the education? How can we support the student and change that? We're not changing what the curriculum is. So sometimes some of these examples that you'll see, this can include, the implementation of assistive technology. That could be specific seating in a classroom, like maybe up front or in the back. That can be more beneficial to a student. It can include extra time for tests, schoolwork. It's not changing what the schoolwork is, but providing more time, but also including assistance for like managing timelines for assignments and providing support to make sure your work is getting submitted on time. So it's providing the accommodations and modifications, but again, not altering the curriculum, content, or lessons. One of the difference in how a 504 looks is that there is no standard form or document for 504 plans. So what this means is each school has the ability to devise their own plan, and to do so, they will have a 504 coordinator. The difference between a 504 plan and an IEP is that schools are not required to invite parents to participate in developing the plan or making small changes to it. However, they do have to notify parents if they're performing evaluations or identifying new diagnoses. And in our experiences, schools generally do inform families, and they do keep a good communication within the making changes or implementing the 504 plan. But we can go to the next slide as well. And like I had mentioned before, 504 plan is not a part of IDEA, and because of that, an IEP ends at the age of 22. However, your 504 plan can carry on throughout life. So an IEP ends when you have received a diploma or you have aged out at 22, because that's when we determine a FAPE has been met. So a free and appropriate public education has been provided to the student. That doesn't mean, though, after high school, they won't need accommodations in college or in employment. So that's where a 504 plan comes in. These are the accommodations and modifications that can follow a student throughout their life. And without diving into it, this is why we really need to inform students on the importance of understanding their disability and understanding why it's important to speak up and access these accommodations and build those self-advocacy skills. Because after graduation, once that FAPE ends, they can still access accommodations and modifications, but the way that they access that is a little bit different, and there's a greater emphasis on them being in that role of accessing their own accommodations and services. But a 504 plan doesn't end, it continues on throughout your life. And shifting gears one last time, we're going to wrap up and end the day with talking about procedural safeguards and due process. This is just going to be a brief overview, as we are not experts. We are not legal experts in any way. And if you do have additional, if you would like to seek additional information on specifically procedural safeguards and due process, we would recommend that you do so from an appropriate legal avenue. So the school is required by IDEA, that federal law, to provide a notice of procedural safeguards to parents of students who have disabilities. What that means is the notice of procedural safeguards is a document that outlines your rights as a parent when working with the school. It doesn't outline the structure of the IEP or the 504, but it's really the rules of proper procedures. It lays out the different avenues that you can use to address when your needs are not quite being met.
Thanks, Dylan. And again, I'm guessing if you've been in an IEP meeting, then you know exactly what that is, because they will ask you if you've received your or they should be asking you if you've received your procedural safeguards. And you know, again, as parents, we should be familiar with them and have a copy of them, because situations do come up. We talk to families all the time. And I actually had one of our attendees had sent me a question about that. So one of the new steps or new avenues, I guess, that families have is an IEP facilitation. So this can happen before you file a complaint. And basically what this is I'll read this and then I'll explain it. But there are times when parents and school district staff do not agree on issues, right, regarding evaluation, the eligibility, services, or placement. If a disagreement occurs and the IEP team, you know, is ineffective, developing an acceptable agreement, then an IEP facilitation is an option. And again, it's optional. So both parties need to agree, the school and the parents. And what happens is a third party, a neutral third party facilitator, it comes in and they really promote effective communication and assist the team in developing a mutual agreement or a mutual acceptable IEP. Again, it's voluntary. So parents have to agree and the district has to agree that they're both willing to participate in this. It's very similar to a regular IEP meeting, except that there's a facilitator, a neutral party there that joins and helps facilitate the communication in hopes of coming to an agreement. And then facilitation doesn't interfere with the procedural safeguards, your rights. So it doesn't impact you deciding to file a complaint and having a mediation and investigation and a hearing and all of that. But it is another step and it is optional. And again, in some of our trainings, we talk to families about, certainly if you need to file a complaint, you have the right to do that. But if it hasn't gotten to that level yet, trying to facilitate a conversation and coming to an agreement between both parties, we always encourage that, right? Because your child is a student there. You want to have a good working relationship. You want to have open communication. You don't want to sever a relationship with the school. However, if there is a need to file a complaint, then that is your right to do so. And with that, I will turn it over to Dylan again.
Yeah, so thank you for that. And a lot of that is still rather new information for a lot of us as well. So thank you for jumping in for that, Allison.
Sure.
But now we're going to kind of talk about some of the more common avenues that have been around for a little longer. So you may be familiar with some of these, but that's complaint, mediation, and then due process. So complaint is when you have an issue arise and you believe that your IEP is not being intended in the way it's meant to be, or there's a violation within the school. So you can file a complaint with the Maine Department of Education. And really at this stage, what the complaint process does is you file the complaint and then a complaint investigator is assigned and they are really tasked with determining if a violation has occurred or it hasn't occurred. So, they come in, they take a look at the situation, and then really their ruling is, was there a violation occurred or was there not? So there's no appeal process for the complaint from the complaint investigator. However, if either party is unhappy with the outcome or they don't agree, there's still other avenues to pursue as well. So essentially a complaint you file with the state, an investigator takes a look at the situation, and they'll let you know if a proposed violation, if that has occurred or has not. But if you're unhappy, you can go to mediation. And mediation is another process. And at this stage, we're really trying to resolve the conflict, with communication from both parties, agreeing to participate, and really coming to a final conclusion here. So a mediator is assigned, and both the parents and the school present their perspectives to them, as well as participate in these discussions on how can they resolve their opposing viewpoints. So really, it's coming together. How can we, come to an agreement, come together with a solution. Similar to the complaint process. There's no appeal process for mediation, and the agreement is considered to be legally binding. However, if you're still not happy with the outcome at this stage, there is additional steps that you can take, with that being next moving forward with due process. And due process is the most intense method. It's the last method by which a dispute may be resolved, and this is a court hearing. So essentially, for a due process, it's a written complaint requesting that due process be filed by MDOE. If you're not able to resolve the situation in those previous avenues, due process would be the final step. And at this stage, a hearing officer is assigned to the meeting. They take a look at whether a violation has occurred or has not occurred, and then give solutions on how it must be remedied. Since this is the final process and this is a court hearing, there is an appeal process if the finding is not acceptable to the parties involved. However, we do advise seeking the other avenues before going straight to due process, similar to how Allison had mentioned. It's really about that working relationship with the school, and understanding what due process entails for the family as well if they decide to go for that process.
Yeah, go ahead, Dylan, sorry.
I know from my experience working with some families, it's quite an expensive process as well. So understanding that a lot of those funds are on the parents. So if you really are able to access a solution or come together into the agreement in the previous avenues, we would recommend that first. And sorry, Allison.
Oh, no, I was just going to say exactly what you were saying, that it's a very lengthy process and an expensive process. Obviously needed if there is a violation. But again, if there is a way, I think the IEP facilitation, that's why it was added, is because it is an option to try to, come to have a neutral party, be present and try to come to some sort of a reasonable agreement between the two parties before ending up in a situation like this.
But there are avenues if disagreements aren't, if violations have occurred, or if disagreements keep occurring. Just being aware of what those look like and how to access them and what they entail. So as we just kind of wrap up here, we're going to just do a quick overview here. And then I also have a survey for folks to please fill out for us as well. I'm just kind of wrapping up on everything. Every student is entitled to receive a free and appropriate public education, that FAPE. We should always focus on a least restrictive environment for all students, and that's really all of the factors of a classroom. Who's providing the education, where is it being provided? It's essential to focus on the I in IEP. How can we make each document individualized for each student? Two students with a similar diagnosis, they should have completely different IEPs because they're completely different students with different needs. If the school and parents cannot come to an agreement, just understanding that there are effective ways to resolve those disputes. If you have any questions, we're here to help as well. So, you feel free to call our offices and, we'd be able to help with any questions or concerns. If we aren't able to help you with your question, we probably know somebody who's able to. So,
and I'll just say too that I just want to mention here that we do have the Family Support Navigator program as well. And again, Family Support Navigators are parents that have been through these different systems of care. They've navigated their own child's special education or special needs, and we train them, and then we can match families with parents that are looking for support. So, and one of the things that a family support navigator can do is help a family prepare or go to an IEP meeting, or again, talk about it afterwards, whatever. So again, our support can be in the realm of IEPs as well. So I just wanted to mention that for families that are here too. And then Dylan did mention as well that we do have a survey, and if you guys would be willing to fill it out, again, we're nonprofit, so the surveys are really important for us to continue to do the work that we're doing and continue to present on these topics for families. So if you have a minute, I think it's pretty brief. So is that it, Dylan? I think so. All right.
Thank you again, everyone. I am going to drop my email in the chat box. Please reach out to me. I'd love to have a conversation and answer any questions. And I'll put yours in there too, Allison.
Thank you, Dylan. Again, thank you for being with us today. Reach out if you need anything. And we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.